Hi, this is Justin from Sonic Scoop, coming at you from my home studio once again, and we've got a great topic for you this week on this music and audio production focused episode of this podcast. I'm going to give you one much better way to EQ, one much better way to set your compressors, one much better way to set your reverbs. Can I make you better at audio in 30 minutes or less? I think so. It's a tall order, but we can do it. I would be amazed if you do all three of these techniques with regularity. If you do two, I will be pleasantly surprised. Tell me about it in the comments. I seriously doubt it. And I think no matter what level you're at, you're going to come away with one or more, and hopefully several more, really decent insights from this episode. Before we get down to it, a couple of quick things. Number one, this podcast has been a solo format so far, me and you talking about audio, music production, music business, studio business. But next month, we're looking to have on a special guest every single week. Hope you stick around and enjoy that format too. Really excited for it. We will return to this solo format now and then, but I hope you enjoy the upcoming episodes. We're going to have on some really cool guests. I'll give you more details about that very, very soon. Thing number two, you know it, I know it. Everybody knows that this podcast would not be possible without sponsors. So big thank you to our sponsors. Right now, I am wearing the t-shirt of one of those sponsors. It is a Focusrite t-shirt. This kind of interesting spoken hub design is really meant to talk about Focusrite. That's the brand here on this t-shirt. About Focusrite's RedNet series of interfaces. Focusrite doesn't just make great, affordable entry-level interfaces and intermediate and pro studio interfaces like the Claret I have behind me, but they also make interfaces that are really meant for high-end studios, significant installations. The RedNet series can do a tremendous amount with networking. I'm not sure if you're familiar with formats like Dante and AVB. Focusrite uses Dante for its RedNet series, but man, the stuff you can do these days without having crazy cable runs, recording from one side of a building to another, networking all the audio devices in a building together. If you're looking to create a higher end studio, do a live sound installation, a live recording installation, have an audio system for business or institution, RedNet series is pretty amazing, even just for a pro studio. Of course, at lower price points, we've got stuff like the Claret I'm talking into right now, simple 2-channel interface, great value. If you were looking for good, clean gain, I can't recommend Focusrite stuff enough. I've been using Focusrite stuff more than a decade. I bought the first Focusrite ISA 428 preamp shortly after it came out. Used that for years and years and years. If you're looking for good, clean gain at tremendous values, the Focusrite stuff is great. For an intermediate studio, something like the Octopre, if you're looking to expand the amount of I/O you have, is also a great bet. Sponsor number 2 for this podcast is another podcast, one of the best in the world. If you have not checked it out yet, you have got to check out the podcast Gear Club. You can find it at gear-club.net or go to iTunes or wherever else you get your podcast and search Gear Club. Really fun podcast by two really fun guys, a couple of great producer engineers, and fine human beings, I might add. I've actually interviewed both of them for Sonic Scoop. One of them, John Agnello, has worked with Sonic Youth, Dinosaur Jr., Andrew WK, Aerosmith, Kurt Weill, a whole bunch of great artists. The other one, Stu Lerman, has worked with St. Vincent, Sharon Van Etten. He's worked on soundtracks for Boardwalk Empire, a whole bunch of Wes Anderson movies. Two really great guys. Funny podcast, but also really deeply insightful. If you haven't checked out Gear Club, you've got to. Let it be your other audio and music production stop in the world of podcasts. Check it out, gear-club.net. That's gear-club.net, or just search iTunes or wherever else you get your podcast for Gear Club. Give it a try. These guys have nearly 100 5-star reviews on iTunes, so you're not wasting your time checking them out. So definitely give them a try. Gear Club. You're not going to regret it. Third sponsor for this podcast, I'm wearing the hoodie, Soundtoys. Soundtoys is one of my favorite plugin brands. If you have not tried out Soundtoys plugins, you do not know what you're missing. If you have tried out Soundtoys plugins, you probably own some of them and do know what you're missing if you don't own all of them. If there's Soundtoys plugins that you have not tried out that you want to try out, go to soundtoys.com, download a free trial. You can get a 15-day free trial of any of this stuff. Try it out. I think you're going to become addicted to Echo Boy if you try it. I think you're going to become addicted to Primal Tap if you try it. I think you're going to become addicted to Crystallizer if you try it. So do yourself a favor, try out these plugins, go to soundtoys.com, download free demos of anything you haven't tried out already, and absolutely can't recommend them enough. Been using them for years. Enough of my absolutely sincere and totally shameless plugs for brands that I love, and into teaching you guys or sharing with you guys a few techniques that have really worked for me and really changed the way that I mixed, really changed the way that I started mastering. And the first one we're going to go into is on EQ. Now, first, I want to reiterate some advice that I don't like, that you've probably heard a million times. And every single magazine, even Sonic Scoop is guilty of this, has some articles where they talk about EQing strategies. And one of them is, don't ever boost, only cut. And when you're looking for frequencies to cut, why don't you sweep through the frequency spectrum, find the frequency that sounds the suckiest, turn that one down, and that's how you EQ. I'm not going to say this is terrible advice, because it's not. It can work. And I think it actually can be good when you're beginning really to train your ear and get a sense for what different parts of the frequency spectrum sound like. So I'm not going to tell you not to do this. But once you've become somewhat more established, more comfortable with EQ, you have a general sense for what each part of the frequency spectrum sounds like, I don't think it's the best way to EQ most of the time anymore. There's a few reasons for this. I'll give you a few of them. Number one, if you are EQing in a less than optimal room, which chances are you are, so many people are, even great mixers are often in somewhat suboptimal rooms. Even great studios can be somewhat suboptimal in certain parts of the frequency spectrum. And if you're at some home studio or kind of intermediate level studio, chances are the room's really suboptimal. And what's happening when you are sweeping through the frequency spectrum is, rather than finding parts of the actual signal that sound bad, you might be finding parts of the room that sound bad. You might get over to 140 hertz or 380 hertz or whatever it is, and all of a sudden there's this really kind of honking resonance there, and you're like, wow, 380 hertz really sucks in the signal, let me take it out. But the problem isn't in the signal, it's in your room. And the more narrowly you're boosting and the more extremely you're boosting, the more that I find that kind of thing can jump out at you. And you can end up turning a signal into Swiss cheese, fighting problems in your room rather than really working on the actual signal. So that's one reason I don't love that advice. Reason number two is that whenever someone is sweeping through and trying to find bad frequencies, they're often doing this in solo. And you probably have heard already that EQing in solo is not the best way to EQ. Who cares what it sounds like in solo, right? The idea is to make each element in your mix sound great against all the other elements in the mix. It's really better to make a signal sound terrible in solo, but great in the mix, rather than the other way around, right? Something sounds terrible in the mix, but great in solo. Who have you helped? Not yourself, right? So I find that this technique lends itself to people soloing and listening that way. So that's another thing I don't love about it. Another thing I don't love about it is when you're boosting so extremely, everything kind of sounds bad, and you can kind of go overboard cutting things. And whenever I see newer mixers doing like 8 different cuts in the mid-range or something like that, it's because they're using this strategy. They found so many things that sound bad when you're boosting, 5 dB, 10 dB, sweeping through. They found so many spots that suck when you're doing that they end up sucking out a lot of the life and a lot of the mid-range out of their tone and trying to solve problems that aren't really problems. That's maybe tied in a little bit to the first reason I don't love it. Reason number 4 I don't love it. Boosting is fun. You should also boost. You should also do that when you're EQing. So don't be afraid of boosting. And I'm going to give you some, I think, much better strategies, or at least one really much better strategy for both boosting and cutting. Here it is. Ready for it? It's deceptively simple. And that is to first listen to the signal you want to EQ in context. First, when you're listening to it, identify the problems. Identify them before you go in sweeping or changing anything. Say to yourself, what is wrong with this signal, if anything? Is it masking other frequencies? Is it too thin? Is it too thick? Okay. Is it too boxy? Get that in your head. Here's what the problem is. And then make a guess about where that frequency range is. Let's say the signal to you, the instrument to you sounds too boxy, too dull. You think there's too much lower mid-range buildup, and that's very common on individual instruments. Where? Where is that happening? Is it 250 hertz? Is it 300 hertz? Is it 350 hertz? Is it 400 hertz? Is it 450? Is it 500? Where do you think that buildup is? Make your best guess. Then go in and cut that frequency. By how many dB? You tell me. Make your best guess. 2, 3, 1. If you don't know, try 2 or 3. See if that sounds better. Does it sound better? If so, great, you win. You're done making your EQ move, potentially. Does it sound worse? Okay, go back. You probably picked the wrong frequency range. Maybe adjust things slightly. If you cut at 450, maybe it was really lower. Maybe it was 250 where you should be cutting. But you don't have to be super precise here. Let's say there actually is more of a buildup in the element that you're trying to EQ at 380 and you cut at 360. Big deal. It's a less efficient cut, but it doesn't really make that much of a difference. Sure, if you cut right at the frequency where there is the most buildup, maybe you could have gotten away with 2 dB of cut instead of 3 dB of cut, or 3.5 dB of cut, or 4 dB of cut. Maybe you could have done a more efficient booster cut. But as long as you're pretty much in the right ballpark, you're in pretty good shape. Now, the other thing to listen for is obviously the intensity, how much you should be cutting. There are no rules. In general, 10 dB is too much, and in general, 0.1 dB is an unnecessary move. So it's a good starting place to try cutting by a dB, 2 dB, 3 dB. If that's not doing enough, try 4 dB. Once you're going past that, maybe ask yourself, am I in the right area? And maybe adjust the frequency a little bit. This same idea goes for boosting. So you think the instrument needs a little more sparkle. Where? Generally, right? Are we talking about the subs, the lows, the low mids, the upper mids, the highs? Let's say you think it is the upper mids. Where? 4K? 6K? 8K? Just pick one of them. Make your best guess. Try it. Put the boost there. A couple of dB. 2 dB. 3 dB. Does it sound better? If it does, great. You're either done or you can try again and see if you can get even better. Or if it's worse, maybe ask yourself, am I cutting or boosting in the right frequency or even the right frequency range? And again, I think you shouldn't be too precious about your audio. Being too precious about your audio, am I boosting the exact right frequency? Am I boosting at 52 hertz instead of 53 hertz? It doesn't really matter. I mean, if you're boosting at 90 hertz instead of 50 hertz, you're kind of missing where you should be boosting, right? But if you're boosting at 60 instead of 50, unless there's some big resonance in the signal, then chances are that you're probably close enough. Of course, you can refine it. Why not experiment? Why not move that booster cut down 10 dB or up 10 dB if you're in the low range? If you're in the high end, why not move that booster cut up or down by 1K? But this general idea, let it guide you that you already know what the frequency spectrum sounds like. Do you know it with complete precision? Can you tell the difference between 480 hertz and 430 hertz? Maybe not, and that's okay. But if you can get in the right area and just do it and just listen and say, was that better or worse at fixing the problem that I have? You are in much better shape than someone going in and just randomly sweeping through the mid-range to find some terrible sounding place to cut. Instead of going in, making Swiss cheese of your signal, ask yourself, first, what is wrong with this, if anything? If nothing is wrong with this instrument, don't EQ it. You don't have to EQ it, right? If it's not bright enough, if it's not clear enough, if it's not full enough, if it doesn't have enough sub, if it has too much sub, then you want to think about EQing it. So first, figure out what's wrong with it, and then figure out what general part of the frequency spectrum that's happening in. Is it the subs? Is it between, say, 50 and 80? Is it the mid bass? Is it, say, between 80 and 120? Is it the upper bass? Is it, say, between 120 and 160? If you get the range right, you actually have a fairly decent amount of leeway to be off a little bit. Make your best guess. If it doesn't sound better, try a different frequency, try again. This goes for both boosts and cuts. If you're on a DAW, I mean, honestly, I'll just type in the frequency that I think I want to EQ and then boost it or cut it. If I'm wrong, I'll just type in a different one. It wasn't 1K. I got it wrong this time. Was it 1500? Type that in. Does it sound better with a booster cut there? There you go. If you're on some type of hardware EQ, just go to the appropriate notch before even boosting or cutting. Say, oh, I'm going to EQ around 4K. Okay, let's put it there. And then try boosting and cutting. See if it sounds better or worse. If you've got it sounding pretty good, you think you're doing a better job at EQing, and you want to try a nearby frequency to sound even better. Hey, 4K boost sounded pretty good. Let me try 5K. Oh, is 5K better or worse? Great. But there's no need to necessarily do all this sweeping. Couple of things here. One, I think once you start really doing this technique, you'll get a lot faster at it. Two is you'll make fewer unnecessary EQ moves, dramatically fewer unnecessary EQ moves. Three, you'll end up making fewer counterproductive EQ moves. Four, it's just a lot more fun. And five, I think you will train your ear to EQ a lot better. And the more that you do this, the more that you'll find yourself getting the right frequency the first time. In the very beginning, when you first adopt this technique, you might not be perfect at landing on the right frequency each and every time. But the more you do it, the tighter and tighter and the more precise you're going to get. So give this a shot. All right, tip number 2 is a way to set your compressors better. And I'm going to focus specifically on one of the aspects of compression that I think people have the hardest time with, and that's setting your attack and release. I don't think I've ever shared this exact technique in any free format. You can probably find something like this in either Mixing Breakthroughs or Mastering Demystified, either of my courses. You can hear me go into a lot more detail on EQ there as well. But this technique, I think, is really going to help give you a handle on setting your attack and release times much better and getting what you want out of compression much more easily, and giving you a conceptual framework for thinking about how to compress. Because I think there's one important element that a lot of people miss when they're compressing, and that is every time that you compress, you are going to have an impact on the attack, on the envelope of the signal. You are always, when you're compressing, either going to be accentuating the attack or decreasing the attack, diminishing it. You're always going to be doing essentially one of those two things relative to the rest of the signal. So I want you to do that with purpose. I want you to have a plan in mind before you even put on the compressor. Whenever you hear a signal you think needs compression, before you put on that compressor, ask yourself, I'm going to end up bringing out the attack or diminishing the attack. So which one do I want to do? Ask yourself that question first before strapping on the compressor. Am I more okay with accentuating attack? Would that be helpful for the signal? Or do I want to decrease the attack? Is the sound too dull? Could it use a little more life? Does it sound too distant? Could it be a little more forward? If so, you might want to increase the attack by using a slow attack on your compressor. On the other hand, if a sound is maybe too thin, too attacky, too tic-tacky, if it is lacking body, if it's too up close, kind of glued to the front of the speakers, and you want to set it back a little further, maybe you want to go with a slightly faster attack to diminish the attack as you're compressing that signal. That's an interesting thing that compression can do that people don't really think about, is it can smooth out a sound by shaving off some of the attack, or it can bring some life and punch and articulation out of the sound by going with slower attack and letting more attack through. So before you put on your compressor, ask yourself, which one of those things am I okay with doing? And then go ahead and go extreme to begin with. If you say I need to bring more attack out of the signal, go with a really slow attack time to start. Say 40 milliseconds, 45 milliseconds, 50 milliseconds, 100 milliseconds. Really let that attack come through so you can hear that effect that's happening. And then make that attack faster and faster and faster and faster until you start to lose some of the benefits of the attack coming out, and then scoot back the other way a little bit. This is a great thing to do in general in audio, kind of honing in to the right signal. Maybe start to an extreme where you know it's going to be too much, get closer and closer to the median until you're losing some of the benefits, and then back off a little bit. Same thing with going with a faster attack. And faster attacks can be great not only for subduing a signal and smoothing it out a little bit, but if a signal is way too dynamic a faster attack compressor is generally going to be better at helping control it than a slower attack one. So if you want to set a fast attack, set it really, really fast. Set it to 0 milliseconds, a half a millisecond, and then open it up and slow it down a bit and a bit and a bit and a bit until you get to a point where all of a sudden there's too much attack coming through, and then back off, back in the other direction a little bit. And that's how you find a great spot for the attack and release. Where should you set your release? When you're doing this exercise, I would say anywhere between 50 and 90 milliseconds is a pretty safe range, maybe 60 to 90 milliseconds. You're probably not going to have the artifacts of too fast of a release or too slow of a release. Man, I could do a whole nother segment on setting the release time. And I do in some of my courses, like Mixing Breakthroughs and Mastering Demystified. And you can check those out if you want to. Great way to help support the podcast if you want to check out either of those courses. There's a money-back guarantee on them, and I go into a lot more detail on setting release time as well. But I think that's a big core takeaway for setting your attack times on your compressors. The third technique I want to share with you today is around setting reverbs. And this, again, is one of those things that a lot of beginning and even intermediate audio engineers, music producers don't take into account properly. And that is setting the pre-delay on a reverb. It is super underutilized in most new mixes from new mixers that I get. They don't really know what to do with pre-delay. They kind of have maybe a sense of what it's there for. Oh yeah, pre-delay, that means before the reverb kicks in, there's a little bit of delay, so you get dry signal and then the reverb. But why would I want to use that? How do I know how to dial it in? And I've got to tell you, if you're not using pre-delay, you are probably taking way too much space up in your mixes with reverb. This is especially crucial for really dense mixes. The more dense a mix is, the more that I think pre-delay is going to help you out a lot by allowing you to get more of a reverb effect while using less reverb, while having less clutter, while putting less mud into your mix. This is a little less essential in really sparse mixes, but in really sparse mixes, pre-delay can still be really fun as more of a creative effect. So a couple of general concepts here. First, I want to say, every time you put on a reverb, particularly in a fairly dense mix that has more than just a few elements, always say to yourself, I'm going to use pre-delay. I just need to figure out how long to set it. Is this a rule? No, you can break it. But it's a good place to start. Whenever you're putting up a reverb, think to yourself, I have to put pre-delay on this thing, or else I'm going to use more reverb than I really need. So when you're setting your pre-delay, you've got to get the timing right. How long is too long? How short is too short? How do you know? Well, a good way to get a handle on that is to think about the tempo of the track. And let's say we have a track that is 120 BPM, right? That means every time there's a quarter note, they're about 500 milliseconds apart, right? There are about a half a second space between quarter notes. And that's probably too long for a pre-delay, unless you're going for a pretty wild special effect, right? So if you have kick, snare, reverb, that's like a little long, right? Boom, snick, ka. It's a little long for pre-delay unless you're really going for that special effect. It can be a bit distracting. Then again, a pre-delay of say 1 millisecond isn't going to do you much good. So obviously 500 milliseconds is often going to be too long, 1 millisecond often too short. So somewhere in between there. How do we find out exactly where we want to end up? Well, continuing to think about this, so if a quarter note at 120 BPM is about 500 milliseconds, then an eighth note would be about 250 milliseconds, right? So you got boom, snicka, getting a little close. I hope you enjoy my onomatopoeia here, my amazing beatboxing skills. But you're getting a little closer, and the reverb is starting to blend a little bit more to closely to the signal. A 16th note would be half that again, right? 125 milliseconds. So boom, snicka. Right? So it's starting to join more and more to the dry sound. And half of that again would be a 32nd note. So that would be about, let me do some math in my head real quick, 61 and a half milliseconds, something like that. And then half of that again, a 64th note would be something like 32 milliseconds. And those are often the ranges you're going to end up in. Something like 30 milliseconds-ish, 60 milliseconds-ish when you're dealing with a 120 BPM track, something like that could be a fairly decent place to start. Where the reverb is far enough away from the dry signal that you can use less reverb while still getting more of a reverb effect, but it's not so far away that's an obvious special effect just jumping out at you. As a general rule, there's something called the Haas effect that says that once signals get more far apart, more delayed than, say, 40 milliseconds or so, we start to hear them as a distinct repeat. And it's something like 40 milliseconds or shorter, the delay tends to blend more with the original signal. So that's a fairly decent threshold to think about, that if you're in that 40 or 50 and shorter range, the pre-delay is going to feel a lot more joined to the initial dry sound. Whereas if you go longer than 40 or 50 milliseconds, you're going to start to hear it more as a distinct delay. But in a really dense mix, if you have that delay really precisely timed to the track, like it's happening right on a 16th or 32nd note, then it can actually still kind of disappear into the rhythm of the track a little bit. And when you have a pre-delay that's really timed well to the beat of your track, to the BPM of your track, you can find that you can get away with longer pre-delays while still having a kind of disappear into the overall rhythms of the track. And this can allow you to get, again, more of an audible reverb effect while using less reverb and while having less clutter. You can use a shorter reverb tail when you have longer pre-delay. You can have less frequencies represented than reverb. You can do more of a low cut, more of a high cut, and still have it be audible when you're using this pre-delay. Great for cutting down on clutter. So again, as a general rule, the longer the pre-delay is, the less reverb you can get away with using, and the more apparent that the pre-delay and reverb will sound. The shorter of a pre-delay that you have, the more reverb you'll probably have to use, the longer of a reverb tail that you have to use, but the less apparent that effectiness of the pre-delay becomes. One last item there is on beat or off beat. When you have a pre-delay really timed precisely to the BPM of track coming right down the center of the beat, it'll tend to disappear into the track a little bit more than if you have a pre-delay that is timed off beat a little bit more. So if you want the pre-delay and the delay effect to jump out a little bit more, you can start being right on beat and then maybe scoot your pre-delay so that it's a little early or a little late. And that, if you want to bring out the special effectiness of it, that can make the pre-delay effect even more apparent. On a really dense mix, it can be worth asking yourself, do I really want to use a reverb at all? Can I get away with a delay? And if you can, on a very dense mix, the delay is going to take up a lot less space and can be a great way to go. Pre-delays on reverbs and delays in general are awesome because, again, they really don't cloud up the attack of the track that you're working on. If you want to make sure that the attack of the track you're working on comes through nice and clear, you don't want to have the reverb happen the exact same second as the attack, which is what's happening when you're not using a pre-delay. If you are using a pre-delay, you can separate the reverb from the attack, giving a little bit more life and punch to that signal. So that's another great benefit of using pre-delays. You're not going to cloud the attack and the impact of the actual sound that you are trying to affect. All right, well, I've thrown a lot at you today, but I think those three techniques, if you really bring them into your craft, can help you work a lot faster, a lot more efficiently. I think you can get much better sounds with these approaches. So EQing, trust yourself a little bit. If you've been doing this for more than a few months or a year, just ask yourself, what do I really need to do with the signal? What general frequency range is that happening in? And what's my best guess for a precise frequency within that range? If it sounds better, good job. If it doesn't, guess again. No big deal. Similar premise with tip number 2. When you are compressing, know that you are going to end up manipulating the attack of the signal in some way. So ask yourself, since I'm going to be affecting the attack of the signal, am I happier with adding to the attack or subtracting from the attack? Because I'm going to be doing one or the other anyway. So let's get it in our heads before we even compress. Which one am I more okay with doing? Is the track going to benefit from having the attack jump out a little bit more at you, from having the sound seem to move further forward in the sound stage from front to back? Does it need a little bit more life, a little bit more articulation? In that case, go with a slower attack. If you want a little bit more punch, a little bit more liveliness, give that a try. Set it really, really slow. And then start moving it faster, 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 faster until you start losing what you're really liking about the compressor, and then back off in the other direction. Same idea if a signal is jumping out too much, it's too glued to the front of the speaker, or if it's a little bit too wild and dynamic, you want to bring some more control, some more smoothness to it. Start with a really, really, really fast attack, and then back off until you get to a place where it's kind of the best of both worlds, where you are bringing that control without totally neutering the attack. Last item is pre-delays. If you are not really thinking about your pre-delay every single time you set a reverb, please do yourself a favor. Start. It is so good for you, so good for your mixes to start using a pre-delay. Not only do you stop clouding the attack of the track that you're trying to add reverb to, but you start being able to use less reverb than you would otherwise, leaving a lot more space in the mix to get clarity and size out of elements. This isn't as essential in really sparse mixes, but in really sparse mixes, it can be really fun and it can stand out more like a sore thumb, more like a special effect. Well, I hope these 3 tips have been useful for you. If you want a lot more on any of these topics, man, I go on forever about EQ and compression and reverb, I hope in the very best of ways, in my courses, mixingbreakthroughs.com, masteringdemystified.com. Check either of those out if you'd like to. Great way to help support the podcast. Another great way to help support the podcast is, if you haven't already, please rate, review, subscribe on iTunes. It really does help spread the word, really does help other iTunes searchers find this podcast. Same thing with YouTube. If you want to subscribe to us there, make sure you turn on the notifications button so you hear about these. Ask questions in the comments on YouTube. I hope to do a question and answer show really, really soon. I've had tremendous questions coming from you guys. Feel free to leave them there in YouTube or go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/SonicScoop, youtube.com/SonicScoopVideo. Or if you prefer old-fashioned email, if you're like me, then go ahead and shoot me an email anytime, podcast@SonicScoop.com. If you have ideas for guests you'd love to see on, topics you'd love to see covered, questions you'd love to see answered, I'm really looking forward to doing a Q&A episode with you guys because the quality of questions that have been coming have been really tremendous, and hopefully I can get yours into an episode very soon. Thanks for hanging out with me, and thanks again to our sponsors, Focusrite, for making such great interfaces like this lovely claret that I'm speaking into right now, all the way up through things like the Octopre and the Octopre Dynamics, all the way up to the RedNet series if you have a serious pro application. And thank you very much to Gear Club. If you are jonesing for more podcasts, if this podcast was a little too short for you this time, you want more? Check out Gear Club. Search for it in iTunes or go to gear-club.net. That web address again, gear-club.net. Check them out there. Stu Lerman, John Agnello, fantastic producers, engineers, really fun guys. I think you're really going to enjoy the podcast. Please check them out. They have a ton of positive ratings on the iTunes store. I think you're really going to like that one. And thank you once again to Soundtoys, one of my favorite plugin brands in the history of the universe, for being a sponsor yet again on this podcast. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. Thanks for hanging out with me. See you next time.